When I was a boy and played with the gang, we did a lot of things. We roasted potatoes and went on expeditions. We tipped over garbage cans now and then. We wrote nasty remarks about the teacher on the sidewalk. But we never spent an afternoon sitting around like this, reading. What a wonderful thing this would be if they were reading something worthwhile, something that would stimulate their desires to build and to grow. But they're not reading anything constructive. They're reading stories devoted to adultery, to sexual perversion, to horror, to the most despicable of crimes.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedman.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomrin is working summer behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey, there's an old saying about the Bible. You can take it literally or you can take it seriously. The same is true for comic books. Part of taking comics seriously is examining the creators behind them, understanding their cultural and artistic contexts, and figuring out why they make what they make. Few are better at doing these serious investigations than today's guest.
We're thrilled to chat with Bob Levin, a longtime contributor to the Comics Journal, whose latest book, Messiahs, Meshugganahs, Misanthropes, and Mysteries, True Tales of Comics, Conflict, and Creativity, is published by Fantagraphics. Bob, welcome to Amusing Jews.
It is really nice to be here. I hope I amuse some people out there, and it certainly amused me thinking about being here.
When you started writing about comics during the 1980s, you hadn't actually read a comic book for over 3 decades. What led you to spill ink on the subject?
There's sort of 2 tracks that converged, so it'll take a while to lay this out. But first of all, when I was a kid, I became obsessed with EC comics. Once I found ECs, that blew all the other comic books out of the water. My parents wouldn't let me buy the horror comics and the crime comics, but I had 2 friends, kids in the neighborhood, whose parents weren't so strict, and I could read them all at their house. And then the Code came along in 1954, 55, and wiped DC out and wiped out my interest in comic books. But I used to have this recurrent dream into adulthood where I would wander into some store which would have crates full of EC comic books available at bargain prices. And then sometime probably in the mid to late 70s, I stumbled into the world of collectibles. And at that point, I was in the process of getting a master's degree in creative writing at San Francisco State. And I was a serious fiction writer. And the way things were supposed to work out then, where you would write short stories and they would be published in quarterlies, and then somebody would come along and ask you if you had a novel, and then you would send them your novel, and then that would be published, and then you were solid. So that happened with me. I published short stories, I won awards, I got asked if I had a novel, I had a novel, it got published, and then I ran into a roadblock. It was like nothing I was writing was getting published anymore. And I didn't know if I didn't think I'd lost my talent. I didn't think I had gotten stupid. But I wasn't connecting with the public. And I was starting to wonder, well, what's valuable about art? And so now and then I get into the collectibles world of comics. And to me, a comic book was worth a dime, because that's what I paid for them. And now I see comic books are selling for $10, $20, $50, $100, depending on things like, are the staples rusty? is a woman being on the cover being stabbed in the eye with a hypodermic needle. These were value diminishments and value enhancements. So that then I started thinking, well, okay, I'm going to buy all these EC comics that I couldn't get as a kid, and well, what am I willing to pay? And I decided $5 a comic was worth it. So I learned about the Comic Buyer's Guide. So I used to get the Comic Buyer's Guide, and there'd be all these ads for people selling comic books, and if they were selling ECs, it didn't matter to me what their asking price was or what the condition was, I would offer them $5. And a lot of the people sold me their comics, and a lot of them didn't. And sometimes the ones that didn't would then raise their prices the next issue, showing an ignorance of supply and demand. But since I was reading the ads, I was also reading the articles in the Comic Buyer's Guide, and I saw that ECs were regarded as a high watermark in comic book history. So I thought, well, I can write an other articles were appearing, and none of them seemed to me to be very good. I thought I can write a better article about ECs than these people can. So I wrote an article about EC and I sent it to the Comic Buyer's Guide and they rejected it. So then I thought the only other publication I knew of was the Comics Journal, which was really out of their league. It was really highly intellectual, highly combative, stuff like that. But I sent it there and they published it. And I got, I don't know, $50, $75. People liked the article. People hated the article. And I thought, well, that was cool. That's what, writing's supposed to be like. And I thought, well, and at that point, maybe I can write another article about comics. And then there was this burning issue in the comics world, which was, why is Roy Lichtenstein making six figures for ripping off, panels from timely comic books? So I knew the answer to that question because I was a big fan of Marcel Duchamp, and I knew about things like that. So I wrote an article as to why he was getting so much money. And they printed that, and then the title was, "Why is Roy Lichtenstein a greater artist than Ghastly Ingalls?" And one of the letters that came in was really disappointed because they had been hoping the article would be about Ghastly Ingalls. And then, and by now I knew that like the next high watermark in comics was the underground comics, none of which I'd read. Then there were two people who dealt underground comics, Bruce Sweeney, who was in Massachusetts, and Don Donahue, who was a few blocks from me in Berkeley. And they had like mailing lists. This was before computers and lists of what they had for sale. So I bought all the arcades and all the Zaps and familiarized myself with these guys. And I got to know Donahue, and I was finding people whose work I was interested in and wanted to write about. And once I sort of like defined who I was what my interests were, then like people at Fantagraphics would say, well, why don't you write about so and so? And since a lot of the underground cartoonists were living in the Bay Area, they were easily accessible to me. And nobody was paying any attention to these guys at this point, which was the late 80s, early 90s. So if I called them up and said, hey, I want to write an article about you for the Comics Journal, they would say, come on over. Whereas if I called some rock musician, they'd have said, screw you, who are you? So I would meet these people and they were all funny and bright and out of their minds. And they had all the issues that any artist had. So I was just, I loved writing about them and I loved meeting them and I just kept doing it, and there I am. So the writing and the comics sort of like came together for me.
And how did this book come about, the Messiahs, Meshugganahs, etc.?
I sell my books myself. And when I would run out of copies of a book, I would write the Fantagraphics and buy a few more from them to replenish my stock. And I had somehow along the line, I had mentioned to Gary about doing another collection. When I was writing the Vaughn Bodie piece, and I got to was interviewing his widow over the phone, and she told me the story about how Vaughn used to lock her in a trunk and then go off for hours and have sex with someone else and then come back to her and unlock the trunk and have sex with her. And I thought, nobody else is going to get this story and write this. I am really doing something that isn't being done. This ought to be, in libraries, my stuff. And so I talked to Gary about it, and Gary, basically was like when Outlaws Rebels came out, he said, congratulations, Bob, you've proved that nobody will buy a book about a bunch of cartoonists no one's ever heard of by an author no one's ever heard of. So finally, about 15 years later, I went to order more copies of Outlaws Rebels, and they were sold out. So I said to Gary, okay, we sold that out. Now it's time to do another collection, because by this point, 15 years had gone by, and I had a bunch of pieces together. And he said, all right, let's think about it. And then COVID hit, and that slowed him down. And then there were trouble getting back up to speed, and I had put it together, and so we worked out a deal. I think I agreed to pay for the proofreading, and I never get an advance because I don't need advances. And he said, okay, we'll do it. And then we were going to do it, and then took a while. Had to wait its turn in the pipeline, and then the next significant delay was I got they print all their books in China. So the tariffs were coming in, and we weren't sure what that would do, but it turned out the tariffs don't apply to books. And then I got an email from Gary that the subject was, "The Chinese hate you and your book." So it turns out if you're being printed in China, the books have to pass through censors. So I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, what is it they don't like to? Is it the kinky sexual lives of some of the cartoonists I write about? Is it the sadistic violence that's depicted by some of the cartoonists that I'm writing about? No. What they objected to was my use of the word Tibet. That was verboten. Hong Kong, that could only be used if I said Hong Kong parentheses China. And Mao's Little Red Book. I couldn't say that either. So I said, well, what about, they checked the real title, quotations from Chairman Mao? No. So I said, screw it, get rid of it. I don't need any of it. So we cut it all out, except I had to write around the Chairman Mao one, because I needed that kept in the footnote. Something that was in a footnote. I didn't want to lose the footnote, so that got through. But yeah, and that slowed things down for a couple of weeks.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
So you were writing about comic book art as legitimate art before such a thing was in the public consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I'm amazed, like, Crumb's biography, Dan Nidell's biography, which is a great biography, by the way, was on the front page of the New York Times Book Review. And the New York Review of Books has their own group of, they're publishing graphic stuff. And it's a new world. My friends still wonder what I'm doing, but
You wrote about your lackluster bar mitzvah in your earlier book, Cheesesteak, which collects your memories of growing up in West Philadelphia. Jewish identity and Jewish ceremony are, of course, not dependent on one another, and despite your lamentable bar mitzvah, Jewishness is nevertheless baked into your writing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I grew up in a family that it was minimally religious, like my father pushed for it. So we belonged to a conservative temple. I had to go to 4 years of Hebrew school which I hated, before I got bar mitzvahed. We would have a Seder, didn't go to services, didn't keep kosher. I can read Hebrew and not understand Hebrew. But, it was a politically liberal, progressive, but not ultra-left, and it valued education and learning and independent thinking. And I think, and I was conscious of also being an outsider. I went to a, I start like after fourth grade, my parents took me out of the public school system and sent me to a private Quaker school just outside of Philadelphia, which I really like, and which had a lot of Jews in it, but it was predominantly Gentile, and the culture was predominantly, you know, suburban WASP, and I was trying to assimilate. I wanted to be one of the guys. But it was also a world where there was, there were girls that wouldn't date Jewish guys. There were restricted fraternities. There were restricted country clubs. There were schools that wouldn't let Jews in or had quotas for Jews. It wasn't as bad as my father's era, which was, but it was there, and you were aware that you were an outsider. And I think that, you know, contributed to the formulation of my identity and how I write and what I write about and the ideas I put out there. Yeah, definitely.
As you mentioned, EC Comics were a big part of your formative years. What attracted you to those titles?
Well, they were clearly the best written comics. They had the best art. Um, some of them had, like liberal politics that was like startling even to a 10-year-old, like this, particularly the books that, I'm blanking on his name, edited. Al Feldstein edited. They were, striking for their politics and sex and violence. I'm, at 10 years old, I have no idea what I was getting out of the sex, but it was, when you go back and look at it, you think, wow, how could they get away with that? And the violence, artistically, the depiction on the page was unsurpassed. Like, they didn't have, before the code, they weren't confined in comic books the way that, like, television was confined or movies were confined as to what you could show. So you were seeing things, and reading things that weren't available in other forms of the media.
That's a great point. I, of course, grew up in a later era when already horror movies were very gory, and that sort of stuff was almost desensitizing the public in a way. But what you're saying with the code in television and movies predating the comics code, it's interesting that that genre, that medium, really was able to survive in the way that it did up until the code, because that stuff was. I mean, still today, it's very shocking to look at some of the EC stuff.
Now, when I go back, like they're really overwritten. The writing is, terrible, but what they're putting across is sometimes, my eyebrows go up too. I think, wow, they were doing that back then. Particularly some of the veiled sexual stuff, which is now resonating with. um, and the other thing, like when the code came in and they got rid of ECs, it was like I said this in my article on EC Comics in the first collection, but it was like we knew that these were the best comic books out there. And our parents didn't know that, and our teachers didn't know that, and the United States Senate didn't know that, and we knew it. So it was like, hey, we don't have to listen to you people about other stuff. And Trina Robbins, I think it was, who said that, like, the 60s came out of Mad Magazine. Disrespect for authority or the willingness to question authority was this generation that grew up on EC Comics.
I especially like your take on Harvey Kurtzman's anti-war comics, such as Two-Fisted Tales, and how those comics didn't go far enough in disturbing or dissuading readers. You mentioned that Kurtzman's patriotism got in the way of harsher storytelling. Could you tell us about that?
He was from a different generation, an earlier generation, and he'd been in World War II. He'd come out of World War II, I guess, and, that was I can't imagine the kind of influence and experience that was for these guys who went through it. Almost all the EC artists went through it. I think Engels was too old. And So yeah, there still was this idea that the United States is the greatest country in the world. I mean, I grew up thinking that, never lost a war. Um, but then, there were all these, it's the 50s, and McCarthyism was still around, and what you could say that could get you into trouble was out there. And then they had the market of dealing with Southern readers and segregation. And so the idea that he can't blame to say that slavery was just one of many factors for the Civil War. Well, he's got to cater to the Southerners, or maybe, they're going to lose advertisers. They're not going to get sold in the South. So the commercial considerations that are going on there too. I mean, they were brave for the times, and they were very brave in comparison to what the other comic books that I remember were doing. But people were just going to go so far. And then my family too. Like I said, there were my family was never really left. I mean, they knew people who had lost their jobs because of affiliations with communists or teachers unions or this or that. And there were people in their social circle who I guess read I.F. Stone or whatever the real lefty stuff was, but I never saw that. We were getting Time and Newsweek and mainstream stuff. We weren't reading the left, even the left of the 50s.
Do you think that Kurtzman's comics kind of appeal to that more liberal, not quite as progressive readership in a way?
Well, I didn't have any problems with them at the time, but like I said, I was 12 years old, 10 years old. It wasn't until I went back and looked back at them, I thought, well, this really doesn't get to the issue of, what's going on and what war is really about. I mean, would be praised for being anti-war, but it wasn't as anti-war as you'd get to with Vietnam, say.
More like Time magazine, less like the communist rag.
Yeah. Well, they were to the left of Time magazine probably, but, certainly not the Daily Worker.
Now that I've gotten more into his art, I think he's just an incredible illustrator too. I don't know if he gets as much credit as he deserves in that realm. I mean, he's a storyteller, etc., editor, but his drawings for those anti-war comics are amazing.
Well, his authenticity was straight. I mean, again, reading him as a kid, you wouldn't know that, but when you go back to it and read about how authentic he was, yeah, he really put a lot of effort, incredible amount of effort into making sure he was getting things right, and that you were feeling it. But even the cover where I forget the one about the cover where the soldiers saying we're not retreating, we're advancing in a different direction or something like that. And there's all this, he's worn out, exhausted. It's still America triumphalism is going out there.
You don't seem to be particularly interested in superhero comics. Is that correct?
Yeah, even when I was buying a lot of comics before I was buying I would read everything, but I didn't read superhero too much. I was thinking about that. Superman himself never appealed to me. Batman I liked. I liked the villains in particular. The Penguin, Joker was a scary villain, and there was a period where I really liked the Justice Society of America. But I gave up on superhero quickly. I also like Scrooge McDuck. I liked Little Lulu. I liked Tarzan. I liked Tarzan. I liked Western comics, Archie a little. But Crime Does Not Pay. That was pretty violent. I liked reading about the gangsters. But yeah, see, and then I did, when Fantastic Four came along, I did look at a couple issues. I have to admit that. But I was in college by then. I was, going to be a writer, serious fiction writer. And they were just, they were comic books. They weren't of any interest to me. Nobody where I went to college read Marvel. Not one person, at least if they did, it was like a bigger secret than being homosexual, which was also a huge secret. 1960s to 1964.
Your essays on comics are refreshing. You don't come across as an eager or apologetic fan, but really as the opposite. For example, you dive deeply into family squabbles surrounding ownership of Frank Frazetta's artwork, which many hold up as masterful, but you find to be empty of the richer human experience that defines great art.
Well, very often I don't, particularly in recent years, um, and it may not show up too much in this book, but some, I don't know anything about the people who I'm asked to write about. And so it's a new experience for me, which I like. Um, and I didn't know anything. I mean, I knew a little bit about Frazetta, but not much. And then it explains in the article how I came to write about Frazetta. And, Fantagraphics sent me some of his books, and I looked at the art, and it was like banal. It was always, the same construction of man and woman, or man and beast, or woman and beast, and usually the man or woman were barely clothed, and whether they were in a steaming jungle or an Arctic wasteland, and it was ridiculous. And there was nothing about human condition being expressed in their stuff. So to me, it was nonsense. But people pay good money for it. Yeah, wasn't and yeah. He just I liked the story, and what I thought I did an interesting job going up and tying it into what else was going on in my life at that time.
And I think that some of the lore behind the family squabble and who gets the rights to his very popular art, I think that actually makes the art more valuable perhaps than it otherwise would have been. But I think you're right. I mean, the whole genre that Frazetta is responsible for is fairly static.
I remember, like, there was some guy with some kind of degree who was a big collector of Frazetta, and I think there was probably I just suspect there was a lot of manipulation to inflate the value of his art, and beef up what individual works could be sold for by the people who already owned a lot of it. Um, that my article didn't get into any of that. It was mainly like what was going on between the brothers.
Could you describe how you approach the various subjects you write about?
I always enjoyed you probably won't remember any of these guys because they were sort of before my time, but the the great New Yorker profile writers like, A.J. Liebling, Joseph Mitchell, St. Clair McKelway, loved their writing. I bought all their collections and read all their stuff, and that's nonfiction. And then when I was starting to write nonfiction, the two writers who I thought the highest of and who I started buying all their books were Joan Didion and Janet Malcolm. And so I was trying to bring that kind of sensibility and that commitment to good writing to the pieces I wrote for the Comics Journal or wherever, the comic related stuff. Um, and, you know, because I was a lawyer, I didn't need my writing to make a living, which um, gave me some freedom in how I wrote and what I wrote about. And I wasn't, you know, out to build a career. I was just trying to write what interested me and ways that satisfied me to write about them. So, look for something original to create something that hadn't been done before. And the Comics Journal and Fantagraphics was really supportive in that way. And, rarely, if ever, tried to rein me in and said, no, you can't do that. They were very supportive and let me, run free. And so I got to like develop this recognizable style. I mean, a funny story about that is, the Comics Journal used to have this message board before the internet, and at some point, some guy said he had hated something I wrote, and he said, "Why do you keep publishing articles by Bob Levin? He doesn't know anything about comic books, blah 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 blah." And But then I thought, well, wait a minute. This guy thinks enough of my writing so that he could remember some other article I wrote, like 6 months before, and remember that he hated that too. So whatever it is I'm doing, it's like I've got this thing going for me. So I might as well stick with it because that's my thing. That's who I am. And so that was like that.
Yeah, hate reading can be a real vitalizing force,
There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, about Proust when he was writing Remembrance of Things Past, and he ran into a critic who he hated in the park, and the critic said, "Oh, I've been looking at your stuff, Marcel, and it's pretty good except for one thing, too much description." And Proust thought to himself, aha, so that's what I've got going.
You had a terrific interview with Trina Robbins, the pioneering feminist underground comics creator and comics historian, who we had on this show shortly before she died. What are your lasting impressions of Trina?
Trina was a mensch, or she would probably prefer a wrench, W-R-E-N. She was funny, she was bright, she was generous with her anecdotes, she was had grudges she wanted to settle, and she had privacy she wanted to respect, all of which, and she made a great interview. I mean, the interview if it was a good interview, it was because of her. It wasn't because of my skills as an interviewer. Her political commitment, was tremendously commendable, and her, not just for feminism, but she was great on other issues too, right till the end of her life. And, she did get honored by the city of San Francisco, that I thought was nice. And deserved, because she was really an important figure in above and beyond the comic book world.
Well, thank you so much, Bob, for joining us.
Thank you.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.